Destiny, I'll turn it to you. I'll put 3 minutes on the clock, and you can put your closing arguments here. And this was a fantastic discussion. Obviously, you have a good debate when the chat is like, if almost 50-50. So I'll go ahead and turn it to you, Destiny, and you can give us your closing arguments, and then I'll go turn it to Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, historically, like there have been examples of things that were considered insurrections that were incredibly small in nature, right? I don't know if anybody died at all in the Whiskey Rebellion. I'm pretty sure everybody that got arrested for that was like acquitted. It was just people basically essentially protesting the whiskey tax laws. This wasn't a massive deal that had like explosions and gunfire and deaths everywhere. I think that we just don't tend to view things as insurrections as much anymore because we don't tend to have insurrections as much anymore because that's kind of become the new norm as the United States has, traveled through or journeyed through time. I think that the 4 elements that I gave, I think were pretty clearly met on January 6th. I think I've demonstrated that we can imagine a ton of events that are riots that wouldn't fit the 4 elements. I understand that Andrew has a really hard time understanding the difference between resisting a law versus just breaking a law. Just because somebody goes out and they engage in rioting doesn't mean that they are trying to resist the law of rioting, that they're trying to make it so that rioting is legal, that that's the goal of that particular riot. Oftentimes, riots can be said to come together to protest other types of things where people feel like the law isn't being executed in a reasonable manner. To say that a bunch of people that show up and end up rioting as a result of a protest that's against, like, say, a cop they feel like wasn't fairly prosecuted is the same as a bunch of people showing up to resist the certification of the vote as laid out in the Electoral Count Act is just not at all the same thing. But we can continue to misread the second element of this, and I understand why, and that's because if you grant the definition or any definition of insurrection, January 6th almost certainly follows from it, and the only way to escape January 6th as being labeled as an insurrection is to use either a ridiculous type of definition that literally nobody historically has ever agreed to, and again, you will never find historical citations, people that use these very unique and contrived definitions of insurrection, or you set the bar of evidence as being unbelievably high, which is saying something like Donald Trump needed to say, hey, everybody, we're going to go do an insurrection, and absent that, even if he's telling people to fight like hell, even if he's tweeting the day before, Vice President Pence has the ability to overturn the election, even if he's saying, like, we need to go down and march and fight like hell and take our country back, none of these things are going to matter if they don't actually use the word insurrection, which I guess means there's no such thing as an insurrection ever having occurred in all of U.S. history. I would say that if you argue with somebody who doesn't believe in a particular definition of insurrection, ask them, has any insurrection ever occurred ever? Which would you consider an insurrection? And then once they start to consider something as an insurrection, say, hey, well, what are the elements that make this an insurrection? Or even more, you could say, historically, what have judges and lawmakers considered an insurrection? People like Andrew will never do that. Instead, they will just play word games all day and try to say, well, riots fit, and what about states, and all these other things that aren't really relevant to defining an insurrection, which, however you define it, January 6th clearly was.
All right. Okay. That was 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I will turn it to you, Andrew, to make your closing arguments. And then, Andrew, from what I understand, you wanted to open up the phone lines, right, and have a discussion with the people after?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. Even if Destiny has other places to go, I'm willing to stick around for call-ins. I've always done that on the Crucible.
Sure.
Sure. And I'm sure there's people.
Right now, as we speak, Bills is firing up the phone line, so we'll get that phone number out and put it on the screen, and you guys can, Destiny, if you want to stay, you can telegraph it to your audience, and we can answer some questions for the people. But I will turn it to you, Andrew, to make your closing arguments.
Yeah, well, it's really funny, this appeal to authority. Destiny grabs this entire nebulous definition from some guy that he respects on the internet and then claims that this is some authoritative definition. This is the authoritative definition because I read it from some guy on the internet. Oh, okay, great. Even though the courts themselves have not ruled on this, and nobody was charged with insurrection. Nobody was charged. Again, one more time, nobody charged with insurrection. Trump acquitted of inciting an insurrection, which, again, nobody was charged with. Talk about nebulous definition. He says, I'm playing word games. Meanwhile, he takes time today, all day, to assemble a 4-point, kind of, this is my definition, completely based on some other guy on the internet, which is crazy to me, right? This is Destiny's personal definition of what this means. And it clearly fits 3 of the criteria for rioting right off the gate. We only had an issue with 2. And then when we apply these, and remember my opening statement, I said in my opening statement, this is going to become very broad, right? There's no way that we're not going to be able to call all sorts of things insurrections that clearly are not insurrections. We come up with the idea of what if a bunch of dope smoking hippies all show up with the united purpose of smoking dope on federal land in order to resist the federal law. And then a couple of them start a fire and one gets beaten up with a baseball bat or something like this. Suddenly that's an insurrection. Clearly, nobody would think that that was an insurrection. Clearly, nobody would think that that's a completely unreasonable standard, right? But it's the destiny standard. And the reason, again, that he had to have such a broad definition, the reason that he needed this, and he needed me to come in and give him some definition he could do an internal critique on, is because his idea that this was an insurrection is only there specifically to villainize the opposition for the purposes of demonization, so that when bad things happen to them, he can call them traitors. That's it. That's the whole game. It's been his whole game now for a while. And this is what got him on Piers and all these other things, which I recently reviewed, was that take. And so in order for him to justify that take, he has to make you a traitor because you don't believe that that was an insurrection that nobody was charged with.